Alberta has had enough.
I have one message. Alberta has had enough.
And you think the defeat would be resounding, or there would be a resounding defeat if it actually got to that point?
Yeah, I have no doubt. We will work hard to make sure that happens.
People are looking to make a big change. People have had enough of the political bull in Canada, and they are fed up and they are done. But could leaving and separating from Canada be an economic disaster waiting to happen? That's exactly what we're going to dig into in this video. First of all, I just want to say we're going to toss aside the political bullshit for this video. I'm just going to give you the bit of truth in this video, and it might not be what people want to hear. I'll happily admit that I would like Alberta to become its own country just to say fuck you to Ottawa. That's how I feel. But I know what feels good isn't necessarily good for me. First of all, let's talk about the political consequences of Alberta separating from Canada. There's actually no formal declaration from the United States that they even want Alberta as a state. And we're going to dig into them becoming an independent country as well. But that is kind of laughable when you actually break down into the finance and economic part of it, which we'll get to later in the video. But the reality is there's no formal declaration from the United States that they want them to join, and Donald Trump is likely to lose the midterms next year, and he might not even be president in 3 years, and then that all begs the question of whether a future government would even want to entertain the idea of Alberta becoming a state. Another thing you have to acknowledge is Alberta is highly connected to both Canada and the United States. But if you look at pipelines, they go through multiple provinces, they go through multiple states, so it's an interconnected system. And Alberta's economy isn't just about oil anymore either, unlike how most people try and depict it. Alberta has an export-driven economy. Exports are now 39% of the economy, and that means that Alberta is heavily dependent on exporting its products to the rest of Canada and to the United States. So if there's any uncertainty about what's going to happen with Alberta's exports, which there would be with a referendum on separation, then that could cause economic violence in Alberta. Because really, the reality is we know from what happened with Brexit and also what's happening right now with the tariffs that businesses do not like uncertainty. They hate uncertainty. And if you look what happened with Brexit, which would actually be very similar to Alberta because there was no mechanism in place for a member state to leave the EU before the UK did, just like there's no mechanism in place right now for a province to leave Canada. So that might take a significant amount of time. And of course, the Liberal government and the federal government would try and prolong that process as long as possible in order to put as many roadblocks in place as possible, and in order to potentially have the whole thing overturned by, let's say, an election in Alberta, because likely you would see the NDP running on a mandate to stay in Canada and a UCP running on a mandate to leave Canada.
Alberta has had enough.
And both campaigns would be heavily polarized. So let's take a look at debt and the currency, because that needs to be discussed as well. Obviously, if you're becoming an independent country, you need a currency. Are you going to use the Canadian dollar? If you are going to use the Canadian dollar, obviously that is controlled by Canadian chartered banks, or would you use the United States dollar? Now, it would make the most sense, you would think, for Alberta to use the US dollar, but then you have to ask the question, well, what would happen to all the debt in Alberta? And there's a significant amount of debt, I hate to tell you. So for consumer debt in Alberta, there's $23,000 per person. It's actually the highest in Canada. And then for government debt, there's $17,000 per person. It's not the highest out of all the provinces, but it is definitely higher than the other prairie provinces. So that would mean that there's 40,000 Canadian dollars worth of debt per person, and one has to ask the question, well, what's going to happen to that debt? What would happen to that debt if they become a state? And the thing is, all these questions that I'm asking right now are things that would need to be answered, and it would take a long time, and there is thousands of questions questions. Then you've got the questions of pensions. You've got the questions of all these different things. And all these questions just create further uncertainty. And that makes businesses less and less likely to invest, which makes major projects less and less likely to happen. If you look at Alberta's oil industry, for example, that's a main focal point. But the reason why Alberta's oil is priced less than other oils is because it's a heavy sour blend of oil. It actually takes a lot of energy to refine that oil, and there's limited refining capacity to refine that oil as well. So that's always been one of the major hurdles. Another big question is what would happen with healthcare. And obviously this would be fought on extensively by the campaign that would want to remain in Canada, because they would basically want to protect the public healthcare system. Now, what is clear is Alberta's healthcare system is pretty and Canada's healthcare system as a whole is completely broken. However, the United States healthcare system is broken, and it's been broken for decades now. The cost of healthcare in the United States is one of the highest in the world. There is wide-scale corruption in the healthcare industry and just massive interests with the pharmaceutical industry, the Federal Drug Administration, and just loads of different interests and corrupt organizations that basically mean that healthcare in the United States, yes, access to healthcare is very good, but it will bankrupt you. The best healthcare models out there are ones where there's private and public healthcare, and they compete with each other. And because public sets the price on public healthcare, that keeps the private healthcare prices down, unlike in the United States, which has just a private healthcare system. And there are pros and cons to both, but you can just imagine if it was on the table that Alberta would be joining the United States, how the campaign would polarize everybody to believe that the healthcare system would totally collapse and be replaced with a healthcare system that would bankrupt you. The interests that would be all over Alberta in actually getting control of that public healthcare system and turning it into a private one would be huge, and that would play a massive influence in what happened. The economy in Alberta has not been in a good place since 2014 and the oil bust with the shale oil boom in the United States. And basically what's happened since then is you've seen GDP per capita that has declined in Alberta. Now, Alberta still remains the richest province in Canada, but when you look at it as a state, it looks like one of the most poorest states in the United States. In fact, it would be the second poorest state in the United States behind Mississippi. So that just gives you an idea of where Alberta's economy is compared with the rest of the United States. And you have to acknowledge that Alberta is extremely isolated, and it's hard to integrate into the United States because of the isolation. And you have to also acknowledge that the United States is increasingly becoming isolationist, and that means for export-driven economies like Alberta, they will be hurt. But obviously, policies and politicians will change over time, and it will be very interesting to see how this pans out. And all I would say to people is there is hope out there, because with a referendum on the table, what you could end up with is massive electoral reform that would mean that Alberta is actually better represented in Canada. And I think that's the thing that people should most hope for, instead of getting polarized and whipped into a frenzy, believing different things from one side or the other, just based on how they feel, instead of the practical considerations of what would happen. Because I'll happily admit that I would like Alberta to become its own country just to say fuck you to Ottawa. That's how I feel. But I know what feels good isn't necessarily good for me, and that's the difference. So anyway, if you've enjoyed this video, I'd highly recommend that you check out this video here. And then if you're looking for a VPN and also want to help support my work, then get ExpressVPN, link in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. See you in the next one. Take care, guys.